Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this May 28, 2014 edition of Nightcast. Well, I'm goofing up the date twice this week already. Friends, the opening story in the news tonight, the big news that's taking the headlines is Egypt elections, Sisi heads for crushing win.
Some supporters of the recently retired Field Marshal Sisi celebrated his victory before the polls closed. But there isn't much to dance about in Egypt. It's divided and impoverished. And apart from imposing security, soldiers were at the polling stations, Sisi admits he doesn't have a political program yet. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has been presented as a national hero, his right to power legitimized by a big yes vote. But the turnout was low. Some Sisi followers, sensing certain victory, might have stayed at home. But during the hurriedly arranged third day of voting, polling stations were still quiet oases here in Cairo, one of the world's noisiest cities. In a cafe opposite a polling station, Sisi supporters said that some people had been brainwashed not to vote in the mosques.
I voted for a Sisi because we want a strong leader, and this country will not survive without a military man.
He said he didn't like backgammon much, but he played it to kill time as business was so bad. You can see Egypt's long-term economic problems by looking round Cairo. There just aren't enough jobs for a young and growing population. In the villages, the Muslim Brotherhood had strong support in the last election. So did their call for a boycott this time round.
This presidential election is not legitimate at all. How can I vote for those who have the blood of Egyptians on their hands?
If I wasn't a true believer who fasts and prays, I'd poison myself. God forbid. We are humiliated. I wish they'd just round us up and kill us all.
Back in Cairo, Tahrir Square is a roundabout again. In 2011, it was the centre of democratic hope. Nagy Kamel was one of the best-known organisers. In January this year, he was arrested.
During the interrogation by state security, I was attacked and beaten, stripped and tortured with electricity. They didn't stop.
Does it feel to you as if Egypt's going back to the time of Mubarak?
Yes, Mubarak's system is coming back, but I don't believe it ever went away.
Since Field Marshal Sisi led the coup which overthrew the Muslim Brotherhood last year, thousands of Islamist and secular activists have been detained. Human Rights Watch said today that repression has stripped this election of any meaning. Whoever runs Egypt, the economy is a fundamental problem. Poverty and corruption cause political instability, anger, and sometimes violence. But Egypt has changed. A cult of personality isn't enough. If President Sisi doesn't make their lives better, Egyptians will lose patience with him too. Jeremy Bowen, BBC News, Cairo.
Thank you, Mr. Bowen, Jeremy, for some well-researched details there. We have some preliminary election results. Sisi gained about 90% of the vote after 2,000 of the 12,000 polling stations reported their results. However, turnout, when the final numbers are in, turnout is expected to show to be lower than 45%, despite a massive push to get more people to polling stations and with an extra day, a third day. But as Jeremy Bowen reported, many groups boycotted the vote. We have another video related to this, friends, again with Jeremy Bowen, where he interviews a man who was arrested early January and says he was tortured. Now, a lot of this will be in the Egyptian language with the interviewee, and therefore it'll have a lot of closed captions at the bottom that you'll have to read. But here is that short report from today with Jeremy Bowen on this.
طبعا ده بعد ما اتعمل تحقيقات من بحث من الدولة اللي تم فيها التعدي بالضرب وصعق بالكهرباء وتجريد من الملابس، واستمر فيها التعذيب فترة طويلة. 15 ساعة دولت كان ممنوع عننا ان احنا نتكلم في التليفون، ان احنا يخش لنا اكل، ان احنا نروح الحمام، ان احنا حتى نقف او نقعد. يعني احنا كنا في وضع التكتل البشري اللي فوق بعضه. يعني ما طبعا قعدنا فترة بنتعالج من الكدمات وآثار الضرب والتعذيب اللي رفضت النيابة ان هي تعرضنا على الطب الشرعي بعدها.
Does it feel to you as if Egypt's going back to the time of Mubarak?
فده جزء ليه علاقة بالسياسة وبالأفراد وبالمؤسسات. يعني فيها عودة لدولة نظام مبارك. أنا رأيي إن هي ما رحلتش على الإطلاق. يعني حصل فترات كان بيحصل فيها خلخلة في السلطة، يعني بتقرر السلطة إن هي تضحي بأجزاء منها، بس هي لم ترحل بعد. لكن على مستوى الجماهير لا، الوضع مختلف. الشعب المصري مش هو الشعب المصري بتاع مبارك. في جيل مختلف موجود دلوقتي، وانا معترف هو اللي اسقط دولة مبارك وما اعترفش باستبداد ورجعية الاخوان المسلمين فشيتهم، ومش هيعترف بحكم المجلس العسكري ولا يعترف بحكم العسكر في مصر. والجيل دوت هو اللي بيفرض المشهد السياسي شكله عامل ازاي في مصر.
What do you think about these elections?
وانا رايي من راي الناس. يعني مفيش انتخابات. يعني انا احنا المشهد اللي موجود في الشارع المصري بقاله النهارده اليوم الثالث ليه مشاهد يعني مهمه. يعني اولا شعبيه السيسي مكذوبه، تضاءلت لما الناس فهمت ان الراجل لا يمتلك غير كلام عاطفي ساذج وسطحي وتافه، ما عندوش اي حاجه. يعني الراجل ولا عنده برنامج ولا عنده خطه ولا عنده رؤيه ولا عنده اي حاجه، وكمان عنده درجه من العجرفه عاليه جدا.
What's the future of Egypt now?
انا عندي ايمان ان الثوره هتنتصر، سواء احنا كنا موجودين فيها او اتحبسنا او متنا او حصل لنا اي حاجه. الثوره هتنتصر لان في ناس من لحم ودم بتدافع عنها وبتموت عشانها، وبتموت عشان الشعارات والافكار اللي هم مؤمنين ومصدقين بيها.
And friends, I was just looking for a verse of scripture while that was ending. If we look at Isaiah 19:2, I've read this before. I've actually typed it out on a slide and put it up on the screen for us before. But this scripture in Isaiah 19, verse 2, well, beginning of verse 1, it says, "The burden of Egypt, behold, the Eternal rides upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. And I will set the Egyptians against the Egyptians, and they shall fight, everyone against his brother, and everyone against his neighbor, city against city, and kingdom against kingdom." As we heard the man talking about a generation that was not going to give good heed, not going to really heed or honor a military rule, we can see that Egypt still got some problems ahead of it. And this verse in Isaiah really is like a prophecy, the duality of prophecy. And what's happening now is perhaps the type of what we're going to see yet in the future. But let's go on. I've got a big story that is one of those types that may help you be able to pray more fervently, Thy kingdom come. A Pakistan woman was stoned by her own family outside of a court in Pakistan. She was killed by her relatives outside the Lahore High Court for marrying against the family wishes. Alpa Patel has this report.
This is the spot where Fazana Bibi died, stoned to death, allegedly by her family, for falling in love and marrying this man, who was also attacked. What is also upsetting about this case is that she was 3 months pregnant. Honour killings are not unusual in Pakistan, particularly in the rural areas of the country. The Human Rights Commission of Pakistan says more than 800 women were killed in honour killings last year. But many more killings are believed to go unreported. Campaigners say this case is particularly shocking because public stonings are very rare. This attack took place in Pakistan's second largest city, Lahore. Fazana Bibi had come to this courtroom to defend her husband. Her parents had told police he had abducted her. But as she arrived at court and in broad daylight, she was publicly stoned and killed before she could make her case. Only her father has been arrested so far. Alpa Patel, BBC News.
Friends, in this next video, the woman's husband, Muhammad Iqbal, told the BBC that police were silently watching. We were shouting for help. Nobody listened.
It was very bad what happened, very bad. Police were silently watching. We were shouting for help. Nobody listened. One of my relatives took off his clothes to capture police attention, but they didn't intervene. They watched Fazana being killed and they didn't do anything. A naked man was crying for help in front of the High Court, but nobody bothered. It's shameful. It's inhumane. We even called the police helpline, but they said it was a wrong number. Most of the suspects are still at large. They are threatening us. Yesterday, they said they would snatch the dead body. We came here with a police escort.
Friends, we turn next to Europe. EU leaders have agreed to re-evaluate the bloc's agenda after voters sent a strong message. European Council President Herman Van Rompuy has said. Mr. Van Rompuy said leaders of the 28 member states had asked him to launch consultations on future policies. He was speaking after a meeting in Brussels to discuss big election gains by populist and far-right parties. Ben Wright reports.
They talked over dinner all evening. David Cameron went in saying Europe had to change. Did they listen to you, Mr. Cameron? But stayed silent on the way out. The Prime Minister believes other EU countries are coming round to his way of thinking. A Brussels that does less but does it better. Over salmon, beef and strawberries, Europe's leaders talked about the Eurosceptic backlash from many EU voters. Even the President of France, stung by the far-right National Front's first-place finish, said it was time for a new direction.
Is this vote of the 27th of May a problem for France? Yes, it is a problem for France to have the Front National winning, and the image of France is tarnished. Yes, there is a problem for France when there is such a doubt among our citizens about what Europe is today.
Mainstream political parties did win a majority of the seats in the European Parliament, and there are EU leaders who think the Eurosceptic revolt will fade away as economic growth returns. The European Union is now at a moment of choice. Some governments want to see powers return from Brussels to national governments. Others want to see much closer integration. Some want a radical change of priorities. Others want more of the same. Sorting out those differences is going to take more than one dinner. Ben Wright, BBC News, Brussels.
Thank you, Ben Wright. And friends, I promised you yesterday that we would play the announcement that President Barack Obama made ahead of today's, that he made yesterday, ahead of today's speaking that we have video that we'll follow on. President Barack Obama is seeking to keep 9,800 U.S. troops in Afghanistan after the U.S. ends the combat mission in the country at the end of this year. The announcement that he made Tuesday, ahead of today's key foreign policy speech, and again, I have video on the foreign policy speech that he made today. We'll play after this. Mark Mardell in this video looks at President Obama's track record.
These freshly minted Marines marching under South Carolina's blazing sun are less likely to end up fighting on some foreign field. They graduate into a world where their commander-in-chief is detailing how the long war in Afghanistan will wind down.
Americans have learned that it's harder to end wars than it is to begin them. Yet this is how wars end in the 21st century. Not through signing ceremonies, but through decisive blows against our adversaries, transitions to elected governments, security forces who are trained to take the lead, and ultimately full responsibility.
When the president visited the troops at Bagram Air Base at the weekend, complete with country singer, he told them this was a pivotal moment. There are more than 30,000 US military in the country right now. Next year it will be 10,000. At the end of the following year, hardly any will be left. Critics say the president has been so focused on bringing troops home that he's ducked conflict in Syria and has been too soft on Russia and China. The most senior Republican on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee told me it's created a more dangerous world.
There are questions today about the United States that haven't been there in times in the past, and I think that creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, other people step in. So I am very concerned about the lack of a clear-sighted foreign policy here in our country.
Pull yourself up! Training on the job can be tough. Pity this poor Marine, stuck, unable to move up or down. While the president's opponents would say that sometimes he seems frozen by indecision, even some friends would admit that occasionally he stumbles, and that he doesn't use the immense power of his office to dazzle or sweet-talk other world leaders.
There is this widespread and growing international perception that the United States has not been as assertive as it should be, that President Obama, for whatever reason, has not been leading with as much energy and vigor as some of his predecessors. I think some of the criticism is unfair, but the White House needs to deal with that criticism, because perception sometimes can become reality.
A president proud of bringing the troops home seems stung by criticisms that he looks weak, and he's about to fight back. The White House says this is the right time for him to set out how America can lead the rest of the world without overextending itself. Mark Mardell, BBC News, South Carolina.
President Barack Obama has promised a new U.S. foreign policy based on collective action with allies abroad. This he spoke in his address today. Now that was from yesterday. This video you just saw, this video coming up is from today, but the president made a comment. He said that the U.S. would still lead. Well, friends, there's a verse in Leviticus 26, one of two chapters called the Blessing and Cursings chapters, in which it says that if individuals and both as individuals and severally or jointly, collectively as a nation, when we do well, God, when we obey God, He blesses us and He gives us very specific blessings. But when we don't obey God, God says just the opposite of those blessings will happen to you. And one of the things God says in verse 19 of Leviticus 26, He says, and I'll break the pride of your power. This is what God says He'll do if the nation doesn't obey Him. He says, I will break the pride of your power, and I'll make your heaven as iron and your earth as brass. So the president may say that the U.S. would still lead. But just, there are other parts of this chapter, Leviticus 26, the blessing and cursing chapters, that says, if you obey God as a nation, I'll make you the lender and not the borrower. But on the other hand, he says, if you don't obey me, then you'll be the borrower, not the lender. So will the U.S. lead? Is the U.S. a lender, or are we one of the world's greatest in-debt borrowers? There's more in the chapter. If you want to read it, Leviticus 26, it's good to see, because if this nation continues to disobey God, that chapter tells you what we're in for and what to be looking ahead for. In this video, with President Obama speaking today before the speaking to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in New York, he said, you'll hear him say, we could avoid the costly mistakes of the past. Mr. President, not if this nation doesn't turn to obeying its Creator. We will be the tail, not the head. The borrower, not the lender. There are plenty more problems Leviticus 26 announces for a nation. The end of the combat mission in Afghanistan at the end of the year is supposed to free up resources to tackle emerging threats elsewhere, the president says. Here he is in this report.
Here the Russian Orthodox priest doing one final blessing as the crew rides the elevator. The three inside in their Soka launch and entry suits. All.
Well, okay, friends, I guess I don't have that video. We do have video, though, that was just about to play. I'll start it over again in a moment. The ISS-bound Soyuz rocket, ISS meaning the International Space Station, launches in Kazakhstan. A Russian Soyuz rocket carrying a 3-man crew to the International Space Station has launched today. NASA's Reed Wiseman, Russian cosmonaut Max Suri. I'm going to let this news reporter tell you who they are, friends. Here's a report from the BBC. Let me just cue it back up here at the beginning on this story.
Here the Russian Orthodox priest doing one final blessing as the crew rides the elevator. The three inside in their Soka launch and entry suits. All the leak checks completed. The Soyuz systems being confirmed. They're ready to go. We have preliminary booster ignition. And liftoff. Liftoff of Reed Wiseman, Max Surayev, and Alexander Gerst, the international crew on their way to the International Space Station. Right now getting good first stage performance. The Soyuz delivering 930,000 pounds of thrust. That's 4 boosters and single core engine. The first stage of the Soyuz measuring 68 feet in length and 24 feet in diameter, burning liquid fuel for the first 2 minutes and 6 seconds of the flight.
And with their rocket blasting its way off to the International Space Station, we'll close tonight's report right there. Thanks for joining me, friends, on this Wednesday night for the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy here on Nightcast. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back again tomorrow night, Thursday evening. Until next time, this is your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying, so long, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on COGTV.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the COGTV.org video archive.